let me just give you guys some advice for those of you who are scrolling on Twitter, scrolling on Instagram, scrolling on TikTok. There are so many different actors involved that want to spread misinformation. So many different actors. And I'm just going to let me just show you two examples of that as an example. Here is Angelo Giuliano, who posted today, Gaza this morning. Imagine just for a second if Russia had done that in Ukraine. Now we know who the animals are. Must have come out of a coma after 2 years before posting this. Here is Jackson Hinkle, recently banned on YouTube and talker at Russian state media, talking head for Russian state media, Russian propagandists. If Russia had done this to Ukraine, there would be U.S. troops on the ground in Kiev, and he spells it the Russian way because he's a colonizing asshole. He wants to colonize Ukraine with Russia. He wants Russia to colonize it. He wants it to colonize it both territorially and culturally.
Druidism has donated $5. Everything is too sad now.
It is very sad. Denying that the Russians destroyed any parts of Ukraine. Now look at this footage here. You see the burnt out buildings, destroyed buildings. There's nowhere in Ukraine that looks like this. Nowhere in Ukraine. We can't find a single location that might look like this. What about this? This is Bakhmut. Everybody knows Bakhmut. What about this? This is also Bakhmut. This is also Bakhmut. Entire city demolished. Nobody can live in any of these homes. The few people that did survive in Bakhmut live deep underground, scared to leave their little, I don't want to call them like rat holes, but they lived under the ground like mice, like scared to come out, scared of the loud noises because the loud noises were explosions. Here is also, if you don't believe that footage or you think it's been altered, in case you are a Russian state stooge, here is drone footage from Russian state media showing the destruction of Bakhmut, which was caused in the vast majority of the destruction by Russian shelling. It's not even a question of, well, how do we know it wasn't Ukrainian shelling? We know that the Russians, for the entirety of this war, have fired many more shells, and they've been much more indiscriminate with their shelling, because the one thing they're trying to take over the Ukrainians, what advantage they have, is they have more artillery guns, and they have more artillery shells, they have more Grad multiple rocket launcher systems, and they're trying to take advantage of it. The most recent estimates I've seen was that the Ukrainians fired 7,000 shells a day, and the Russians fired 60,000 shells a day. The difference between Russian artillery crews and Ukrainian artillery crews is Ukrainian artillery crews take a lot more time to try to be a lot more accurate with their shots, not out of necessarily the most humanitarian interest, even though I do think a lot of them are thinking about, having to retake this territory and retake a lot of times their homes, but it's also because they only have so many shells. You only have so many shells to use, and some of the shells that they're getting from the West, for example, like the not Kinzhal, what is it called? I'm thinking of the one that's fired out of the M777 howitzer. Oh, the Excalibur. A lot of the Excalibur shells are a lot more accurate, but we know that the Russians have engaged in this type of bombardment. They've used thermite, they've used thermobaric weapons, they've used multiple rocket launcher systems, S-300s, artillery bombings, Kinzhal missiles fired from ships, missiles fired from planes.
Flemmy gifted 5 Tier 1 subscriptions. Last news I heard on German TV was that the amount of shells fired is almost identical. And Western artillery is more accurate.
I don't know. I see conflicting reports, and from my experience on the front, I think the Russians do fire more. And I was in the area of the Zaporozhye counteroffensive. I do think, compared to that report I heard about the 7,000 to 60,000, it didn't feel that disproportionate in Zaporozhye. It didn't. But it was also one singular experience I'm talking about, or like one or two experiences with artillery crews. So I don't want to speak for the entirety of the artillery logistics or artillery output, because I had a few filming experiences with them, and that didn't flush out with the 7,000 to 60,000. It wasn't that disproportionate. It wasn't that heavy. It wasn't that disproportionate in my experience, but I was also in the area of the Zaporozhye counteroffensive, so I don't know if that is a good example to use for the entirety of the front line, because in the Zaporozhye counteroffensive area, they're going to be firing more shells than generally the rest of the country, because they're trying to push in this area. But I have read other reports that say it's less disproportionate, but still, It's disproportionate. And during the Battle of Bakhmut, it was even more disproportionate. And if, for example, you don't care about Bakhmut, I can talk about any of the cities and towns that have been literally wiped off the face of the earth. And when I say wiped off the face of the earth, I mean literally wiped off the face of the earth, as in it does not exist anymore. This is, I wanted to show you Popasna. This is a town, a city in eastern Ukraine that was completely wiped out. Every building destroyed in the city, to the point that when the Russians did finally capture it, they announced they weren't going to rebuild it. The occupation effort said it was pointless because every building's destroyed, so this city no longer exists. The Russians are literally, not figuratively, literally wiping cities off the face of the earth. Literally wiping cities off the face of the earth. Oh, if the Russians were as brutal in their bombing campaign as the Israelis, America would have troops on the ground. Bullshit. Bullshit. They were unbelievably brutal, and we didn't put troops on the ground. Same thing happened in Grozny, and we didn't put troops on the ground. Same thing happened in Syria, and the areas where the bombing was most brutal, we didn't put troops on the ground. We put troops on the ground in northeastern Syria, and then engaged in a pretty brutal bombing campaign ourselves. Either way, this type of bombing campaign has been going on for the Russians. This is the Russian government pushing a narrative that they did not engage in this type of horrific bombing, and they're trying to use Israel to shield themselves from criticism. That's why these talking points are getting put out there. I'm just being blunt with you. I'm not saying every single person that repeats that were directly handed that talking point from the Russian government, but that's why the Russian government is promoting these talking points, because they want to point to Israel and say, look, they engage in that type of behavior, so we can engage in that type of behavior. Or even better, wow, the Israelis are so much worse than us. They're just hoping that people have short memories. But a lot of this Russian disinformation around this war and how they're trying to pursue their own state interests is a little bit more complex than that. A little bit more complex than just hoping that the viewer has bad memory. Here is a fake BBC report produced to make it look like Ukrainian weapons were taken from stockpiles that America gave Ukraine by corrupt defense officials, sold to Hamas, and then Hamas used those weapons against Israelis to commit terrorism and slaughter Israelis. This is a completely fabricated report. No report exists like this from the BBC. No report exists like this from anywhere. There is zero evidence verifying or provided for these claims whatsoever. But they know how BBC makes videos, and so they just edited a BBC video like it was a YouTube short or TikTok, or made for somebody scrolling in one of those types of social media apps for Twitter. And they just added some fake text, added some BBC music, put the logo in the corner, and they've been sharing it in the circles, promoting this disinformation to make it look like Ukraine is at fault for Hamas terror in southern Israel. Let me show you this video. Look, this looks like a legit BBC video. Now, if any of you had like two brain cells and you knew a little bit about the conflict and you saw the text, you'd immediately start raising eyebrows that the BBC would, number one, say this, but number two, report this. And if they were to report this, that there would be no link to an actual BBC article. Let me show you the video. Download the app. It's edited just like a BBC video. If someone who was scrolling on social media and didn't really know much about the war in Ukraine, didn't really know much about the war between Israel and Palestine and Hamas, they would see this and maybe they wouldn't think twice. And they'd be like, oh, wow, that's crazy. I didn't know that. Maybe these weapons are not helping. Maybe they're hurting. Maybe they're not helping the Ukrainians liberate. Maybe they're helping terror attacks. Oh, I guess I'm against Ukraine aid now. I've talked about the polling that's been done before, that when you introduce people to basic facts about the war, like the fact that the Ukrainians have liberated over 50% of the territory that they've taken back, or the amount of Russian armor that has been lost, over 50% of their armor reserves. You see support for Ukraine and support for aiding Ukraine with more supplies jump 15 to 20 points amongst independents, amongst Democrats, and the largest jump, I think it was about 18 to 19 points, was amongst Republicans. The Russians know this. They know that the more that people see their atrocities in Ukraine, the more people learn about Ukrainian history, the fight they fought against Russian control of their politics, amongst their fomenting of corruption, the funneling of weapons into the Donbass over the last 8 years, the illegal invasion and annexation of Crimea, the murder of political activists, the deportation of those who don't want to accept Russian citizenship, the seizing of their property rights, the massacres of Bucha, the massacres of Hazra, the massacres in Kupiansk, the massacres in so many different places. Not Kupiansk. I was thinking of not Izium. I'm thinking of another no, it's Izium. It was Izium. I was thinking, I got Irpin and Izium mixed up. There's so many massacres, you mix them up sometimes. If people have this information, they're more likely to support Ukraine. You're seeing jumps of 50% in favor of more aid to 70% overall. That's a gigantic jump. And so Russia has to push against that. That is them trying to pursue their own state interest through misinformation. And I didn't talk about this too much. And the reason I didn't talk about nation states pursuing their state interest through disinformation on social media before is because a lot of times it's hard to know the intentions as to why somebody makes a social media post. It's hard to know the intentions. It's hard to see a post and be like, well, do we know that this was done by, this government or that government? But when you see stuff like this, the only intention of videos like this is to try to use every single foreign policy conflict to try to undermine aid to Ukraine. And there is one party that wants this more than any other party in the world, and we know they have a track record of disinformation through the Internet Research Agency. We saw that with the 2016 election. No matter how much people try to downplay it, you can say that it wasn't a literal overthrow of our democracy. I can understand if you call that hyperbolic. But you can't pretend that the disinformation campaign did not exist or that the Russian government is not trying to use asymmetrical information warfare to undercut Ukraine's support. Its support structure in Germany, support structure in Sweden, in Finland, in the United Kingdom, in Poland, and all across the world, and in the United States. When you see posts like this, when you see the spreading of misinformation, not only should you call it out, not only should you be doing the added context and everything you can, but please, for the love of God, double check your sources and be aware that there are state actors trying to manipulate you, not only when it comes to the war in Ukraine, but the war that they're trying to connect this to, the war between Hamas and Israel. Israel is perfectly willing to engage in disinformation campaigns. Hamas is certainly willing to engage in disinformation campaigns. So is Hezbollah, so is Palestinian Islamic Jihad, so is Iran, so is Syria, so is basically all of the parties involved. And I'm not saying that all these atrocities or anything that you're seeing in your feed is necessarily fake. What I am saying is that when you have such heightened emotions, so many people are in their information echo chambers because of how the internet works. So many people are so invested and have their own interests when they're trying to post information about the war that's going on. And there's so many different intelligence agencies and media agents that are working for these different forces that you need to look out for yourself in information hygiene. Double check everything, triple check everything, quadruple check everything. And if you can't find a source for it, you don't need to repost it. You don't need to like it, even if it confirms your biases that you had beforehand. And I know that's the hardest for you guys, and I know it because I see you guys sometimes liking posts that are not true, but agree with the cause that I know you agree with. Double, triple, quadruple, check. This is a war where people are dying. Over 1,000 people killed in terror attacks in southern Israel. Gazans right now are having their homes collapse in on them, suffocating in their own homes, surrounded by the four walls that they built families in. There is no need to trample on the dead. And the people who post the fake video game footage, and I've said this before, they are the only people who deserve to die in terror attacks and see what the true reality of war is, because they are trampling on the dead more than anybody else for little dopamine hits on the internet. Those people are rat bastards. I remember I saw that Israeli defense officials say there's no innocence in Palestine. I don't agree with that. I think that type of dialogue could be used to engage in terrible, terrible activity. I suspect that that's part of the reason that they're using that language. The only non-innocents are the people who repost armor footage and pretend it's real. Those are the only non-innocents that should not be protected by the Geneva Convention.